They called him the preacher, but he'd never touched a Bible in his life. 17 years ago, I watched him walk into Redemption Valley carrying nothing but a saddlebag and the kind of silence that makes mountains nervous. By the time he left 3 days later, 11 men were dead. A fortune in stolen gold had vanished, and the only witness who could speak was a mute girl of 9 who drew pictures that made grown men weep. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The desert holds its breath when death comes riding. I learned that watching a man they'd come to call the preacher descend into Redemption Valley on a September morning, so clear you could see tomorrow in it. His horse was a gray gelding, half-starved but moving with the kind of dignity hunger can't kill. The man himself sat straight back despite the dust coating him like a second skin, his hat pulled low enough that shadows did the work his face refused to do. Redemption Valley wasn't on any official map. Towns like ours existed in spaces between law and chaos, built by men running from something and sustained by men who'd forgotten what they were running toward. We had one main street, if you could call it that. A strip of packed earth flanked by buildings that leaned into each other like drunks sharing secrets. The saloon, the general store, the assayer's office where Silas Crowe weighed gold with scales that always favored his thumb. And at the far end, standing alone like a monument to optimism nobody felt, the church that hadn't seen a preacher in 5 years. The stranger reined his horse outside the saloon, dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose body remembered wounds even if his face didn't show them. He tied the gelding with a loop that would slip free at the first sign of trouble, the mark of someone who'd learned that exits matter more than entrances. When he pushed through the saloon doors, the afternoon light followed him in, cutting through the tobacco smoke like God's own judgment. Inside, the usual crowd was drinking away the usual sins. Miners fresh from a placer claims upstream, their hands still stained yellow with river gold. Ranch hands spending wages they'd already drunk twice over. And in the back corner, holding court like the petty king he'd made himself, Silas Crowe sat with his 3 brothers, Marcus, the eldest and meanest, Jacob, who could draw a pistol faster than thought itself, and Thomas, the youngest, whose smile was all kindness until his knife found your ribs. The stranger walked to the bar without looking at anyone, yet somehow seeing everything. His movements had the quality of water finding its level, natural, inevitable, unstoppable. The bartender, old Pete McCallum, set down a glass without being asked and poured whiskey from the good bottle, the one reserved for men who carried danger like other men carried pocket watches. Passing through, Pete asked, keeping his voice low, conversational. In Redemption Valley, questions were invitations to trouble, but Pete had survived 15 years by knowing which questions needed asking. The stranger sipped his whiskey. Let's settle before answering. Depends on what I find. And what are you looking for? A girl, 9 years old, blonde hair, doesn't speak. The stranger's voice was dry prairie grass, brittle with disuse. Taken from a homestead 3 weeks back, south of here. Trail led me to your valley. The saloon had gone quiet, not the sudden silence of danger, but the gradual hush of men realizing they were hearing something important, something that might reshape the boundaries of their small world. In the back corner, Marcus Crowe had stopped mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on the stranger's back. Pete's hand trembled slightly as he corked the bottle. Mister, you just described a ghost. We had a girl fitting that description, but she disappeared 2 weeks ago. Vanished from the church where someone had been keeping her. Someone. The stranger turned then, finally, his face emerging from shadow. He was older than his voice suggested, 40, maybe 45, with skin weathered to leather and eyes the color of winter ice. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, kind of mark a man gets from violence that should have killed him. That someone got a name. Before Pete could answer, Marcus Crowe's voice rolled across the room like thunder over flatland. The girl you're asking about is none of your concern, stranger. She was being cared for. Then she ran off into the desert. Probably dead by now. Happens to children out here. The stranger studied Marcus with the attention a man gives to a snake coiled in his path. Interesting thing about children. They don't run from kindness, only from cruelty. Marcus stood slowly, his bulk rising like a mountain deciding to rearrange itself. His brother stood with him, Jacob's hand already hovering near his pistol, Thomas smiling that terrible smile. You calling me cruel? I'm stating a fact. Whether it applies to you is something you'll have to settle with your conscience. The stranger set his empty glass on the bar with a soft click that somehow carried more weight than Marcus's bluster. But I'm going to find that girl, and I'm going to have a conversation with whoever took her. Those are the only two facts that matter to me. Jacob stepped forward, his fingers flexing. He was fast. Everyone in the valley knew it. Man had died testing that speed. Maybe you should reconsider your facts, old man. Our valley, our business. Your valley, my mission. The two don't have to conflict unless you make them. The stranger turned back to his glass, signaling Pete for another pour. The gesture was somehow more insulting than any words could have been. A dismissal, a statement that the Crowe brothers weren't worth his continued attention. That's when Thomas made his mistake. He circled around, coming up on the stranger's blind side. That knife already palmed in his hand. The blade was halfway to the stranger's ribs when the stranger moved. He didn't seem to hurry, didn't appear to exert himself, but somehow the knife was in his hand instead of Thomas's, and Thomas was on the floor with his arm bent at an angle. Arms aren't meant to bend, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. The stranger held the knife up to the light, examining it with professional interest. Quality steel. Spanish make, if I'm not mistaken. Damascus fold. Worth more than the man carrying it, which I suppose says something about priorities. He placed the knife on the bar, then returned his attention to Thomas, who was still writhing. Your arm's dislocated, not broken. Count yourself lucky. Next time someone turns their back on you, consider that it might be a test. Marcus and Jacob hadn't moved. They were frozen in that terrible moment of recalculation, when violent men realize they've misjudged their opponent. The stranger stepped over Thomas, walked to their table, and pulled out a chair. The wood scraped against the floor, a sound like a coffin lid sliding open. Let's talk about the girl, he said, sitting down as if he'd been invited. Her name is Sarah. She's the daughter of William and Martha Brennan, homesteaders who made the mistake of settling on land someone else wanted. They were murdered, whole family except Sarah, who hid in a root cellar. She saw everything. Can't speak because of what she saw, but she remembers. And she can draw. He pulled a folded paper from his coat, smoothed it on the table. It was a child's drawing, crude but unmistakable. It showed 4 men on horses. One of them was massive, with a beard. Another was thin and quick. The third was smiling. The fourth held a torch. In the corner of the drawing, carefully printed in a child's hand, Crowe. I've been tracking her for 3 weeks, the stranger continued. Every town, every settlement, asking questions. Most people were too scared to answer, but I found a trader who'd seen 4 men bring a blonde girl through the valley. Said they took her to the church. Said she was being kept safe until they could figure out what to do with her. His eyes moved from Marcus to Jacob. That was 2 weeks ago. Then she disappeared. Now, I'm going to ask one more time, and I want a truthful answer, because my patience is finite and my mercy is exhausted. Where is Sarah Brennan? Marcus's face had gone from red to white. You don't know what you're stepping into. Then educate me. That homestead was on gold land, rich vein, discovered by accident when Brennan was digging his well. He tried to file a claim, but the assayer's office disagreed, said it was unclaimed territory, open to whoever found it first. When Brennan wouldn't leave, things got complicated. Complicated. The stranger's voice could have frozen whiskey. That's what you call murder now. Progress in terminology. The girl saw too much, heard too much. We were keeping her safe until she forgot. Children don't forget. They bury. There's a difference. The stranger stood, picking up Thomas's knife from the bar. Last chance. Where is she? That's when the shooting started. The first shot came from Jacob, fast as promised, but aimed at where the stranger had been, not where he was. The stranger had moved the moment he saw Jacob's shoulder dip, that telltale sign of a draw beginning. The bullet punched through the chair back, splinters exploding in the afternoon light, filtering through the saloon's grimy windows. The stranger's return shot was almost simultaneous, and Jacob went down clutching his shoulder, his pistol clattering across the floor. Pete dove behind the bar with the instinct of a man who'd survived too many gunfights to count. The other patrons scattered like quail, overturning tables, scrambling for doors and windows. Marcus reached for his gun, but the stranger was already moving, closing the distance, turning the saloon into a close-quarters nightmare where size and strength meant less than speed and certainty. The stranger's fist caught Marcus in the throat, a precise strike that collapsed his windpipe and sent him to his knees, choking. Thomas, recovered enough to be dangerous again, launched himself from the floor, that terrible smile on his face. But the stranger had picked up a chair, and Thomas ran face first into Oak, the impact dropping him like a puppet with cut strings. In less than 10 seconds, the Crowe brothers were down, bleeding, gasping. The stranger stood among them, not even breathing hard, his pistol held loose and ready. He surveyed the room, checking corners, confirming threats. When he was satisfied, he holstered his weapon and walked back to the bar, where his whiskey sat undisturbed. "Pete," he said, his voice conversational, as if violence hadn't just torn through the room like a tornado. "I believe we were having a discussion about the church." Pete rose slowly from behind the bar, his hands shaking. "Mister, you just signed your own death warrant. Silas won't let this stand. He runs the assayer's office, but he runs the whole valley too. Those are his brothers you just put down. Then Silas and I will have words. But first, the church. You were about to tell me something." Pete glanced at the Crowe brothers. Marcus was still choking, his face purple. Jacob had passed out from shock and blood loss. Thomas was out cold, his nose clearly broken. None of them were listening. Pete leaned close, his voice barely a whisper. "The girl was at the church, like you said. Old man Porter was supposed to watch her. But 2 weeks ago, someone broke in. They found Porter dead, knife in his back. Girl was gone. No tracks, no trail. Just gone, like she'd never been there." "Porter have any enemies?" "Everyone's got enemies in Redemption Valley. But Porter kept to himself. Harmless. Whoever killed him was sending a message." "What message?" Pete hesitated, then said, "That even churches aren't safe. That nowhere in this valley is safe if you cross the wrong people." The stranger finished his whiskey, set the glass down with that same soft finality. "The wrong people? You mean Silas?" "Silas owns the assayer's office, controls the gold flow. Anyone wants to stake a claim, they go through him. Anyone finds color on their land, he evaluates it. And somehow, the richest strikes always end up in his ledger, not theirs. Folks who complain." Pete gestured to the Crowe brothers. "Complications arise." And Sarah's father complained. Loudly, filed papers with the territorial office, was planning to ride to the capital, make his case directly. Then his homestead burned. Pete's voice dropped even lower. They found 3 bodies. Brennan, his wife, their oldest boy. But folks said there were 4 people living there. The girl was unaccounted for. Most people figured she died in the fire, body burned beyond recognition. But you're telling me she survived. She survived. Hid in the root cellar while her family burned above her. Stayed there 3 days before she dared come out. When she did, she walked straight to the nearest settlement and collapsed. The doctor there treated her, kept her safe. She couldn't speak, but she could draw, and she drew the crows." Pete wiped his forehead with a trembling hand. "Mister, why are you doing this? You're not law. You're not family. What's a mute girl to you?" The stranger was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that went beyond words. "I used to be marshal of a town called Silver Creek. Good town. Good people. We had a bank robbery go wrong. Outlaws took hostages, including children. I made a call, told my deputies to hold fire, to negotiate. While we were talking, the outlaws executed one of the children. A girl, 8 years old, blonde hair. His eyes were distant, seeing something beyond the saloon's walls. I carry that with me. Every town, every trail, looking for a chance to balance the books. Sarah Brennan is that chance. Before Pete could respond, the saloon doors burst open. Silas Crowe stood in the entrance, backlit by the late afternoon sun. He was smaller than his brothers, compact and wiry, but he carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight that mattered. Behind him stood 6 men, all armed, all wearing the look of hired killers comfortable in their trade. "I heard there was trouble at my brother's table," Silas said, his voice soft and reasonable. He stepped inside, his men fanning out to cover the room. "Seems I heard right." The stranger turned slowly, his hands visible empty. "Your brothers started a conversation they couldn't finish. I'm willing to let it end here." "Generous of you. But you see, you've created a problem for me. My brothers may be fools, but they're my fools. Can't have strangers beating them bloody in my town. Sets a bad precedent." "Your town. Interesting claim. Last I checked, Redemption Valley didn't have a deed with your name on it." Silas smiled. It was a businessman's smile, cold and calculated. "Possession is 9/10 of the law, friend, and I possess quite a lot here. The assayer's office, the general store, the saloon you're standing in, even the church where that unfortunate girl was being kept. Kept, not sheltered, not protected. Kept, like property. Everything's property, friend. Gold, land, information, people. The sooner you understand that, the longer you'll live." Silas gestured to his men. "Now, I'm going to give you a choice. You can walk out of here, get on your horse, and ride out of my valley. Forget about the girl. She's gone, probably dead like Porter. Or you can insist on being difficult, and we'll bury you next to him." The stranger studied Silas and his hired guns. 6 against 1. Poor odds by any calculation. But there was something in his stance, his bearing, that suggested he'd faced worse. "Third option," the stranger said. "You tell me where Sarah Brennan is. I take her somewhere safe. You and your brothers answer to the territorial marshal for murder, robbery, and kidnapping. Everyone walks away alive, more or less." Silas laughed, a sound like stones grinding. "Marshal? The nearest marshal is 2 weeks' ride from here. By the time anyone official arrives, this valley will have forgotten you existed." "Maybe, but forgetting and forgiving aren't the same thing." The stranger's hand moved toward his pistol, not fast, not threatening, just resting near it. A statement of intent. "Last chance, Silas. The girl." Silas's smile vanished. "Kill him." The 6 hired guns drew together, a synchronized motion born of practice. But the stranger was already moving, diving behind the bar as bullets tore through the space he'd occupied. Pete screamed, covering his head. Glass shattered, wood splintered. The saloon transformed into a storm of lead and chaos. The stranger came up with Pete's shotgun, the one the bartender kept for emergencies. Both barrels roared, buckshot spreading in a deadly pattern. 2 of Silas's men went down, screaming. The stranger rolled, came up behind an overturned table, his pistol out now, firing with methodical precision. Another man dropped, clutching his chest. Silas was shouting orders, but his men were breaking, realization dawning that they were fighting someone who understood violence at a level they didn't. The stranger moved through the saloon like smoke, using cover angles, the room's geometry. His shots didn't miss, didn't waste. Each bullet found flesh, bone, the soft places where men keep their mortality. When the thunder stopped, 5 of Silas's men were down. The 6th had fled. Silas himself stood frozen, his pistol half drawn, staring at the stranger who'd emerged from the gunsmoke like something mythical. The stranger's gun was pointed at Silas's chest, his finger on the trigger, a single pound of pressure from ending it. "The girl," the stranger said, His voice was steady, but something burned behind it. For the last time. Where's Sarah Brennan? Silas's hands were shaking. I don't know. I swear. Porter was keeping her. When he died, she vanished. We searched everywhere. The mines. The desert. Nothing. Who killed Porter? I don't know that either. Porter was useful. He did what he was told. Kept his mouth shut. Killing him made no sense. The stranger studied Silas's face, reading truth and lies. Unless someone wanted the girl for themselves. Someone who knew what she'd seen. What she could draw. Silas's eyes widened slightly. Understanding. The mine. There's an old played-out shaft on the western edge of the valley. Porter used to hide things there. Claimed it was safer than the church. If she ran, she might have gone there. She was there when Porter brought her to the valley. He showed her the hiding places in case something happened. The stranger backed toward the door, keeping his gun trained on Silas. You're coming with me. What? Insurance. In case you're lying. Or in case someone tries to stop me. The stranger gestured with his pistol. Move. As they stepped into the street, the sun was setting, painting Redemption Valley in shades of blood and gold. And somewhere in that dying light, a 9-year-old girl was hiding, waiting, hoping someone would find her before the darkness did. The western edge of Redemption Valley was where hope went to die. Abandoned mine shafts pockmarked the hillside like bullet wounds, monuments to dreams that had struck rock instead of gold. The desert reclaimed everything out here. Wooden support beams collapsed into splinters, rail tracks twisted by heat and time. Equipment rusted into abstract sculptures of failure. As twilight deepened, the landscape took on an otherworldly quality, shadows pooling in the valleys between hills like dark water. The stranger kept Silas ahead of him, close enough to grab, far enough to shoot if needed. They'd taken Silas's horse and the stranger's gelding, riding in silence broken only by the creak of leather and the soft fall of hooves on hard-packed earth. Behind them, Redemption Valley was a scatter of lights, small and temporary against the immensity of the desert night. You're making a mistake, Silas said. Not for the first time. Even if the girl's there, even if you find her, where are you taking her? Every settlement between here and civilization answers to someone like me. There's no safe harbor for her. Then I'll find one that doesn't exist yet, the stranger replied. Keep riding. The mine shaft Porter had favored was near the top of a ridge, marked by a collapsed head frame and a scatter of broken timbers. A narrow path switchbacked up the slope, barely wide enough for a horse. The stranger dismounted, gestured for Silas to do the same. We walk from here. Any sudden movements, and you'll find out if I'm as good with a knife as I am with a gun. Silas's laugh was bitter. You're good with everything except self-preservation, friend. That's going to get you killed. Everyone dies. The only question is whether it matters. They climbed in silence, boots scrabbling on loose shale. The mine entrance was a mouth of darkness in the hillside, shored up by timbers that looked like they'd been standing through sheer stubbornness. The stranger pulled a lantern from his saddlebag, lit it with a match that flared bright in the gloom, then gestured Silas forward. After you. You're insane. That shaft could collapse any moment. Then walk carefully. The mine swallowed them. The passage was narrow, claustrophobic, lined with rough-hewn rock that wept moisture. The lantern's light pushed back the darkness, but couldn't defeat it, just created a bubble of illumination in an ocean of black. Their footsteps echoed strangely, multiplying, as if ghost miners walked beside them. 50 feet in, the passage opened into a wider chamber where multiple tunnels branched off in different directions. Evidence of old habitation marked the space. A broken chair, a rusted cooking pot, a bedroll that had moldered into unrecognizable fabric. Porter's hiding place. The stranger held the lantern high, turning slowly, examining every shadow. Sarah, he called softly. My name's Ezekiel. I knew your father. I'm here to take you somewhere safe. Only echoes answered. The stranger set the lantern on a flat rock, freeing his hands. Stay here, he told Silas. Make noise. and I'll assume you're trying to warn someone." "Warn who? There's no one here." "Then you have nothing to worry about." The stranger moved deeper into the mine, checking each branched tunnel methodically. His hand rested on his pistol, but his movements were careful, non-threatening. If Sarah was here, she'd be terrified, ready to run. He needed to project safety, not danger. In the third tunnel, he found it. A crude drawing on the rock wall, done in charcoal. It showed a man with a hat like his, standing next to a horse. Beside it, carefully printed, "Help." "Sarah," he called again, softer now. "I saw your drawing. I know you're here. I know you're scared. But I promise, I'm not going to hurt you. I came a long way to find you." A sound, subtle, a shift of cloth against stone. The stranger turned slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper darkness beyond the lantern's reach. In a narrow crevice at the back of the tunnel, something moved. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm going to sit down now. See, no threat." He lowered himself to the ground, cross-legged, making himself small, unthreatening. "Your father was a brave man, fighting for what was his, fighting for you. I'm sorry I couldn't help him, but I can help you now." Slowly, painfully slowly, a small figure emerged from the crevice. Sarah Brennan was a ghost of a child, blonde hair matted and filthy, dress torn, face streaked with dirt and tears. But her eyes burned with something unquenchable, something that violence and terror hadn't managed to extinguish. She held a piece of charcoal in one hand and a sharp rock in the other, ready to fight if needed. The stranger didn't move, barely breathed. "My name's Ezekiel. I'm going to reach into my coat now, very slowly. Just getting something to show you." "Okay." Sarah's grip tightened on the rock, but she nodded almost imperceptibly. The stranger drew out a folded paper, the drawing Sarah had made weeks ago, showing the Crowe brothers. "A doctor gave me this. Said you were brave. Said you saw what happened and remembered. I need you to know. The men who hurt your family can't hurt you anymore. Not while I'm here." Sarah stared at the drawing, then at the stranger. Her mouth worked, trying to form words that wouldn't come. Instead, she held up her piece of charcoal and pointed to the wall. "You want to draw something?" A nod. The stranger waited while Sarah approached the wall, knelt, and began sketching with fierce concentration. The drawing took shape quickly. Another figure, thinner than the Crowe brothers, standing apart. Above it, she drew a building that could only be the church, and in the building, she drew a small figure, herself. But the thin figure was standing outside with something in his hand, something that looked like a knife. Understanding hit the stranger like a physical blow. "Porter didn't die protecting you. Someone killed him to get to you." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. She drew more, the thin figure chasing her, Sarah running into the desert, hiding in the mine. And then a final detail. On the thin figure's chest, she drew a star, a marshal star. "Jesus." The stranger breathed. "The law is already here, and it's hunting you." A voice echoed from the main chamber. Silas shouting, "Ezekiel, company." The stranger was moving before conscious thought caught up. He scooped Sarah into his arms. She barely weighed anything, fragile as bird bones, and ran back toward the lantern light. Silas stood where he'd been left, hands raised, facing the mine entrance. Silhouetted against the night sky was a tall, thin figure wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. On his chest, even in the dim light, a marshal's star gleamed. "Marshal Boyd," Silas said, his voice carefully neutral. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Where's the stranger?" Boyd's voice was cultured, educated, nothing like the rough drawl of most frontier lawmen. "I heard there was trouble in town. Figured I'd investigate. He's in the tunnels, looking for a ghost." Boyd's eyes flicked past Silas, catching the stranger emerging from the tunnel with Sarah in his arms. His hand moved toward his pistol. "Well now, looks like you found her." The stranger set Sarah down gently behind him, positioning himself between her and Boyd. "You're the one who killed Porter. Old fool wouldn't tell me where the girl went. refused to cooperate with a lawful investigation. Boyd's hand rested on his pistol grip. That child is a material witness to a crime. I'm taking her into custody. Whose custody? Yours. The same man who helped the Crowes murder her family. Boyd's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation. You are interfering with a federal investigation. That's a crime. Step aside. Federal investigation into what? How to steal gold from dead homesteaders. How to silence witnesses. The stranger's hand moved toward his own pistol. That star you're wearing. Where'd you get it? Off a real marshal's body. Boyd smiled. It was a terrible thing, that smile. Empty. The thing about law in places like this, it's whatever the man with the star says it is. And right now, I'm saying you're under arrest. Dead or alive. Your choice. Third option, the stranger said. You draw that pistol, and we find out which of us is faster. Boyd's smile widened. I was hoping you'd say that. They drew together. The mine shaft amplified everything. The metallic whisper of pistols clearing leather. The thunder of simultaneous shots that rolled through the tunnels like the earth itself was screaming. The flash that turned shadows into stark black and white tableaus of violence frozen in time. Boyd was fast, faster than Jacob Crowe, faster than anyone the stranger had faced in Redemption Valley. His bullet caught the stranger in the left shoulder, spinning him. The impact like being struck by a hammer. But the stranger's shot, fired even as he fell, caught Boyd in the chest, punching through the star, through flesh and bone, into the heart that had stopped beating for justice years ago. Boyd staggered, looked down at the blood spreading across his shirt, then up at the stranger with something like surprise. Fast, he whispered. Then he fell and didn't move again. The stranger hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his shoulder. Sarah screamed silently, her mouth open but no sound emerging. Silas stood frozen, staring at the two men down, calculating angles, probabilities, survival. Silas, the stranger gasped, his right hand still holding his pistol, trained shakily on the assayer. Help her, please. Silas looked at Sarah, at the stranger, at Boyd's body. Something shifted in his expression, not conscience exactly, but a recognition of when to cut losses. He knelt beside the stranger. Your head bad. Bullet's still in there. Needs to come out. After. Take Sarah. There's a settlement 2 days east. Mission. Tell them Ezekiel sent you. Tell them. He coughed, tasted blood. Tell them she needs sanctuary. Why the hell would I do that? Because you're calculating. Because Boyd being dead changes everything. Without him protecting your claim to Brennan's gold, the territorial office might actually investigate. Because helping this girl is the only thing that might keep you from hanging. The stranger's eyes bored into Silas. And because somewhere under that greed, you're tired of being the villain. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed, a sound without humor. You're insane. You know that. Frequently mentioned. Will you do it? Silas looked at Sarah again. She stared back with those fierce, unquenchable eyes. Finally, he nodded. I'll take her. But you're coming too. Can't have you dying in this mine. Bad for the reputation. Together, moving slowly, painfully, they made their way back down the mountain. The stranger's shoulder bled steadily, turning his shirt dark. Sarah walked between them, her small hand gripping the stranger's uninjured arm, anchoring him to consciousness. Back in Redemption Valley, Pete the bartender took one look at the stranger and sent for the closest thing the town had to a doctor, a former army medic named Garrison who'd seen enough bullet wounds to know which ones were mortal and which were merely agonizing. He set up in the church, laying the stranger on a pew that served as an operating table. This is going to hurt, Garrison warned, heating a knife and lantern flame. Everything hurts, the stranger replied. His eyes found Sarah, standing in the corner. But not everything matters. The bullet came out in a spray of blood, and the scream the stranger tried to swallow. Garrison cleaned a wound with whiskey that burned worse than the bullet, then stitched it closed with hands that had performed this surgery on battlefields from Shiloh to Gettysburg. You'll live, Garrison said. if infection doesn't set in, which is a big if. The stranger nodded, too exhausted to speak. Sarah approached slowly, carrying a cup of water. She held it to his lips, helped him drink. When he was done, she pulled out her charcoal and a piece of paper someone had found. She drew quickly, certainly. When she was finished, she held it up. It showed the stranger standing tall, his hand on Sarah's shoulder. Behind them, the sun was rising, and for the first time in her drawings, Sarah had included herself smiling. The stranger took the drawing with his good hand, studied it. "Thank you," he whispered, "but I'm not the hero you think I am." Sarah shook her head emphatically. She drew another quick sketch, a gravestone with the word passed on it. Then she drew an arrow pointing to a sunrise labeled now. "The past doesn't define me?" the stranger asked. Sarah nodded vigorously. Would that it were so simple. Over the next 3 days, Redemption Valley transformed. With Boyd dead and the Crowe brothers either wounded or in custody, the oppressive weight that had hung over the town lifted. Miners who'd been afraid to file claims suddenly found their courage. Families who'd been planning to leave decided to stay. Pete reopened the saloon with a new rule. No guns, no grudges, no ghosts. Silas Crowe, to everyone's surprise, made good on his promise. He arranged for Sarah's transport east, providing supplies, horses, even a letter of introduction to the mission. The night before they left, he visited the stranger in the church. "Why'd you do it?" Silas asked, sitting on a pew. "Risk your life for a girl you'd never met?" The stranger, still weak but healing, considered the question. "You asked before what she was to me. Truth is, she's nothing. Just another child in a world that chews children up and spits them out. But I've spent years trying to balance books that can't be balanced, trying to replace one child with another, thinking if I save enough of them, I'll forget the one I failed to save. Does it work? Never. Not even close." The stranger looked at Sarah, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. "But I keep trying anyway, because the alternative is accepting that some debts can't be paid, and I'm not ready for that." Silas nodded slowly. Boyd had ledgers in his office, records of every claim he'd helped the Crows steal, every family they'd ruined. "I'm giving those to the territorial marshal. Real one this time. Figure it won't bring back the dead, but it might stop more dying. That's more than most men do." "Yeah." Silas stood, adjusted his hat. "You know, there's a position open. Town assayer. Pays decent. Could use someone who isn't afraid of the Crows." "I'm not staying. Didn't figure you would. Men like you don't stay anywhere. Just pass through, leaving things different than you found them." Silas paused at the door. "For what it's worth, thank you." The next morning, Sarah left with the caravan heading east. Before she climbed into the wagon, she ran to the stranger and threw her arms around him. He held her carefully, mindful of his shoulder, feeling her small body shake with silent sobs. "You're going to be okay," he told her. "The mission will keep you safe. Teach you to read, right? Give you a future that isn't running." Sarah pulled back, looked at him with those fierce eyes. Then she spoke. One word, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "Father." The stranger's breath caught. "No, I'm not." But Sarah smiled, shook her head. She drew in the dust at their feet. A figure labeled Father. An arrow. A figure labeled Ezekiel. An equals sign. "You're saying I remind you of him?" Sarah nodded, then corrected the drawing. She crossed out the equals sign, drew 2 figures side by side instead, both labeled Father. "I see." The stranger's voice was rough. "Then I promise, when you're ready, when you're safe and strong, I'll come back, check on you, make sure the world's treating you right." Sarah hugged him again, fierce and desperate. Then she climbed into the wagon, and the caravan moved out, carrying her toward a future the stranger had bought with blood and pain. He stood watching until they disappeared over the horizon. Then he turned to his gelding, still waiting patiently. "One more thing to do," he told the horse. "Then maybe we can rest." He rode south, toward the Brennan homestead. The Brennan place sat in a shallow valley where a creek ran year-round, making the land valuable in a region where water was more precious than gold. The stranger could see why William Brennan had fought so hard to keep it. Good grazing land, timber for building, and beneath it all, according to Silas's stolen records, a gold vein rich enough to make men kill. The homestead itself was a ruin. The fire had done its work thoroughly. The main house was collapsed into charcoal and ash, the barn a skeleton of burned beams. Only the root cellar remained intact, a stone structure half buried in the earth, the place where Sarah had hidden while her family died above her. The stranger dismounted slowly, his shoulders still aching with every movement. He tied his gelding to what remained of a fence post and walked through the ruins. The desert had begun reclaiming everything, weeds pushing through ash, dust accumulating in corners. Soon there'd be no evidence anyone had ever lived here. He found the graves on a rise overlooking the creek. 3 wooden markers, weathered and nameless. William Brennan, Martha Brennan, their son, whose name the stranger had never learned. He stood before them, hat in hand, feeling the weight of arrived too late pressing down on his shoulders. "I'm sorry," he said to the graves, to the wind, to whatever listened in this desolate place. "I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner. Sorry I couldn't stop what happened. Sorry your daughter had to see." His voice broke. He swallowed hard. "But she's safe now. I promise you that. Safe and on her way to people who'll care for her, who'll teach her to speak again, to trust again. It's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's what I can give." He pulled out the drawing Sarah had made, the one showing him and her together, standing under a sunrise. He looked at it for a long moment, memorizing every line, every hopeful stroke of charcoal. Then he folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat, next to his heart. From his saddlebag, he retrieved tools, a shovel, a saw, what he'd bought in Redemption Valley, working slowly, pausing frequently to let the pain in his shoulder settle. He constructed 3 new crosses. On each, he carved a name, dates approximated from what little he knew, and a simple phrase, "Loved and remembered." By the time he finished, the sun was setting, painting the valley in the same shades of blood and gold that had marked his arrival in Redemption Valley. The stranger stood back, examining his work. It wasn't much, rough carpentry at best, but it was more than these people had before, more than the world had given them. A sound made him turn. A figure stood at the edge of the property, Silas Crowe, sitting on a horse, watching. The stranger's hand moved toward his pistol, but Silas raised both hands, showing they were empty. "Easy," Silas called. "I'm not here for trouble." "Then why are you here?" Silas rode closer, dismounting when he reached the graves. He looked at the markers, at the names carved there. "Came to see it for myself. The place my brothers destroyed, the people they killed." He was quiet for a moment. "Marcus died this morning. Infection from where you hit him. Jacob will probably live, but he'll never use that arm right again. Thomas," he shrugged. "Thomas is Thomas. Won't learn, won't change." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to know I'm done. Closing the assayer's office, selling my interests in the valley, taking what money I have left and going somewhere I'm not known. Somewhere I can be someone other than Silas Crowe, the man who got rich on stolen land." The stranger studied him. "Redemption's a long road." "Yeah, but I figured I should at least start walking." Silas pulled out a folded paper. "This is the deed to this property. It was in Boyd's records. Legally, it reverts to the territorial government, but I'm going to make sure it goes to Sarah Brennan instead. Her birthright. When she comes of age, she'll have the choice to reclaim it or sell it. Either way, it'll be her decision." The stranger took the deed, examined it. "This is worth a fortune." "Yeah, and it's not mine. Never was." Silas mounted his horse. "You know, they're the reward for Boyd. $500. Federal warrant for corruption and murder. I filed the claim in your name. I don't want it." "Didn't figure you did. That's why I had it transferred to an account in Sarah's name. Mission will manage it until she's old enough." Silas turned his horse. "For what it's worth, you're a better man than I'll ever be." "That's not a high bar." Silas laughed. a sound that carried more sadness than humor. "No, I suppose it's not." He rode away, and this time the stranger didn't try to stop him. Alone again, the stranger returned to the graves. He knelt, his bad shoulder protesting, and placed his hand on William Brennan's marker. "I'm going to make you a promise," he said quietly. "I'm going to watch over her. Not close. I'm not her father, much as she might want to believe otherwise, but from a distance. Make sure the mission treats her right. Make sure she grows up safe. And when she's ready, I'll bring her back here. Let her see what her father fought for. Let her decide whether to keep it or let it go." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of creosote and distant rain. The stranger stood, gathered his tools, and walked back to his gelding. Before mounting, he turned for one last look at the homestead, at the graves on the hill, the ruins in the valley, the creek running eternal. "May you find peace," he said to the ghosts. "God knows you earned it." He rode north as darkness fell, leaving Redemption Valley behind. But he carried something with him now. Not just the guilt that had driven him for years, but something else, something lighter. Not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of it. The faint hope that debts, if not erased, might at least be acknowledged. That some balances, if not settled, might at least be recognized. The desert stretched before him, vast and empty and full of possibility. And for the first time in years, the stranger thought he might understand what William Brennan had been fighting for. Not gold, not land, but the chance to build something that mattered. To leave behind evidence that his life had counted for something beyond violence and loss. The stranger rode toward the horizon, toward towns he'd never seen and justice not yet served. Behind him, 3 graves stood watch over a valley where, against all odds, something like hope had taken root. 3 years passed like water through cupped hands, impossible to hold, impossible to stop. The stranger who'd called himself Ezekiel rode the circuit of frontier justice, appearing in places where law was thin and violence thick. He took no payment beyond expenses, asked for no recognition, just moved from town to town, crisis to crisis, leaving behind settlements slightly less broken than he'd found them. But twice a year, he made a journey east. The mission sat in a valley where civilization had gained a tentative foothold. Whitewashed buildings surrounded a church whose bell could be heard for miles. Gardens tended by patient hands grew vegetables that tasted like hope. Children who'd been broken by the frontier learned to heal here, sheltered by nuns whose faith was matched only by their practical determination to do good in a world that rarely rewarded it. Sister Maria met him at the gate, as she always did. She was old, her face lined by decades of frontier sun, but her eyes were sharp and kind. "She's been watching the road for 3 days," Sister Maria said, without preamble. "Somehow she always knows when you're coming." "How is she?" "See for yourself." Sarah Brennan at 12 was taller, stronger, but still carried that fierce light in her eyes. She'd learned to speak again, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. The nuns said she had a gift for languages, for expressing herself with words she'd been denied for so long. She ran to Ezekiel when she saw him, no longer the fragile ghost child, but something resilient, something unbreakable. "Father," she said, throwing her arms around him. The word had become their private truth, not biological, but something deeper. The bond forged between someone who'd saved and someone who'd been saved. "Hello, little hawk," Ezekiel replied, using the name he'd given her. "You've grown again. I'm not little anymore." "No, I suppose you're not." They walked the mission grounds together, Sarah telling him about her studies. Latin, mathematics, history. The nuns were preparing her for something beyond survival, for a life that included choices, possibilities, futures. "Sister Maria says I could be a teacher," Sarah said, "or maybe a doctor. Says women are starting to do those things now, if they're smart enough and stubborn enough." "You're both. Is it wrong that I want to go back?" The question came quietly. "To the homestead. I dream about it sometimes. The creek, the sound of father working in the barn, mother singing. I know it's gone, but it's not wrong. It's human. Ezekiel stopped, turned to face her. The deed is waiting for you. When you turn 18, you can reclaim it, build something new on what was lost, or sell it. Make your own choice. But until then, learn everything you can. Become someone your father would be proud of. Sarah nodded, blinking back tears. Will you always come back? As long as you need me to. What if I always need you to? Ezekiel smiled, a rare expression that softened the hard lines of his face. Then I suppose I'll be riding east twice a year for a very long time. They sat on a bench overlooking the valley, watching the sun track across the sky. Sarah leaned against him, comfortable in silence. Finally, she spoke again. Sister Maria says everyone has a purpose, that God puts us where we need to be. Do you believe that? Ezekiel considered. I don't know about God, but I know that sometimes, if you're lucky, you find something worth fighting for, something that makes the fighting mean something. Like me, like you, and like every other Sarah and every other town who needs someone to stand between them and the wolves. He looked down at her. But you're not a victim anymore. You're a survivor, and soon, you'll be someone who helps others survive. That's how it works. We save each other. Sarah was quiet, absorbing this. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded paper, one of her drawings. She handed it to Ezekiel. It showed a man on horseback, riding toward a sunset. But unlike her earlier drawings, this one included something new. Behind the rider, following at a distance, were other figures, other people he'd helped. They weren't with him, but they were there, connected by invisible threads. You're not alone, Sarah said softly. Even when you think you are. Everyone you've helped, we're all riding with you. Ezekiel stared at the drawing, feeling something crack in his chest. The armor he'd built around his heart, piece by painful piece, developed a fissure. Light leaked through. Thank you, he whispered. He stayed at the mission for 3 days, longer than usual. He helped repair a fence, told stories to the younger children, listened to Sarah read her essays about justice and morality with a maturity that awed him. On the third evening, as he prepared to leave, Sister Maria approached him. She worries about you, you know. Prays for you every night. I'm not worth praying for. That's not for you to decide. Sister Maria fixed him with that sharp gaze. You've given that girl something precious. Hope, purpose, family. But you've also given her fear. Fear that one day you won't come back. That you'll die in some nameless town for some nameless cause. We all die eventually. Yes, but some deaths matter more than others. Some men die having made a difference. Others die still trying to balance books that can't be balanced. She paused. Which do you want to be? Ezekiel had no answer. He left at dawn, Sarah standing at the gate, waving until he disappeared over the horizon. As he rode, he thought about her drawing, about the figures following behind him, about the weight of carrying so many hopes, so many lives he'd touched. The circuit of frontier justice continued. A mining camp where claim jumpers had murdered a family. A railroad town where corrupt officials were selling indigenous lands. A settlement where a wealthy rancher was using violence to drive out smaller homesteaders. Ezekiel moved through them all, a ghost in a duster coat, leaving justice in his wake. But something had changed. The work no longer felt hollow. Each person he helped wasn't just another attempt to balance unbalanceable books. They were their own person, their own story, their own future. And he was part of that future now, connected by those invisible threads Sarah had drawn. 5 years after Redemption Valley, Ezekiel received a letter. It was delivered to a trading post where he'd left instructions for Sarah to reach him if needed. The letter was brief, written in Sarah's careful hand. Father, I'm 18 now. The deed is mine. I'm going back to the homestead, not to live, but to see, to remember, to understand what Father fought for and what you fought for. Sister Maria says you're somewhere in Colorado. If you can, meet me there. I'd like you to see it with me. Your daughter in all but blood, Sarah. Ezekiel read the letter 3 times, folded it carefully, and rode south. The Brennan homestead had changed. The ruins were still there, but someone had been caring for the place. The graves on the hill had fresh flowers. The root cellar had been cleaned. And near the creek, someone had planted a young tree, an apple tree, already bearing fruit. Sarah was waiting there, no longer a child, but a young woman of purpose and strength. Beside her stood a young man, rough-handed and honest-faced, wearing a silver badge. "Father," Sarah said, embracing Ezekiel. "This is James, deputy marshal for the territory. He's been helping me prepare the homestead." Ezekiel shook the young man's hand, reading him in a glance. Good man, honest, the kind who'd stand between Sarah and danger without hesitation. "Deputy, Mr. Ezekiel, Sarah's told me about you, about what you did for her." "I did what needed doing. More than that, sir. You gave her a future. She's using it well." Sarah led them through the property, pointing out where buildings had stood, where memories had lived. She showed them the tree she'd planted. "For Father," she explained. "Something living to remember him by. Something that will outlast all of us." They climbed to the graves together. Sarah knelt, placed her hand on her father's marker. "I'm home, Father. Not to stay, but to honor you. To thank you for fighting so hard. For teaching me that some things are worth fighting for." She looked up at Ezekiel. "And to thank him for finishing what he started. For keeping me safe. For giving me time to become who I am." Ezekiel knelt beside her, his aging knees protesting. "Your father would be proud of you, of the woman you've become. Are you proud of me?" "More than I can say." Sarah smiled through tears. "Then I've done well." They stayed at the homestead for a week. Sarah showed Ezekiel her plans, not to rebuild and settle, but to deed the land to the mission, to create a place where other survivors could come, could heal, could learn to hope again. The gold, when finally extracted, would fund it. A legacy built on tragedy, but dedicated to healing. "The past doesn't have to define the future," Sarah said. "You taught me that." On the day Ezekiel prepared to leave, Sarah gave him one final drawing. It showed the homestead as it had been, whole, alive, thriving. But in the corner, she'd drawn the future. Buildings for the mission, children playing, people healing, and standing guard over it all, a figure in a duster coat. "That's not me," Ezekiel protested. "I won't be here." "You'll always be here," Sarah corrected. "In spirit, in memory, in the example you set." She hugged him tightly. "You can stop running now, Father. You've balanced the books. The girl you failed to save at Silver Creek, she'd forgive you if she could. And the girls you've saved since, we've already forgiven you. Now you just have to forgive yourself." Ezekiel held her, this remarkable young woman who'd emerged from tragedy to create hope. "I'll try. That's all any of us can do." He rode north as autumn touched the land with fire. Behind him, Sarah and James stood at the homestead, already beginning the work of transformation. Ahead, the frontier stretched vast and unforgiving and full of people who needed someone to stand for them. Ezekiel touched the latest drawing in his pocket, feeling its weight. For the first time in years, the ghosts that rode with him felt less like accusations and more like companions. The girl from Silver Creek, William Brennan, all the others he'd failed to save. They weren't demanding payment anymore. They were simply there, reminding him that every life mattered, every choice carried weight, every act of justice made a difference. He didn't know where the road would lead next, what town would need him, what injustice would demand his attention. But for the first time, he rode toward it not out of guilt, but out of purpose. Not to balance unbalanceable books, but to honor the trust Sarah had placed in him, to be worthy of the word she called him. Father. The desert wind carried the scent of rain and new beginnings. And somewhere in the vast frontier, justice waited to be served by a stranger in a duster coat who'd finally learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a future that honored both the dead and the living. The stranger rode on, no longer quite so alone, carrying with him the hopes of all those who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. And in his wake, he left behind towns slightly better than he'd found them, people slightly more hopeful, and a legacy that proved one man, determined and stubborn, and refusing to give up, could still make a difference in a world that often felt too broken to fix. Redemption Valley was far behind him now, but its lessons rode with him always. That justice, however delayed, still mattered. That children were worth fighting for. That even the most broken men could find purpose if they were willing to look for it. That the past, while impossible to erase, didn't have to dictate the future. And that sometimes, in the vast loneliness of the frontier, family wasn't defined by blood but by choice, by sacrifice, by standing between the innocent and the wolves, no matter the cost. Ezekiel rode toward the horizon, toward whatever waited there, carrying Sarah's drawings close to his heart. And behind him, invisible but unmistakable, rode all the others, the saved, the avenged, the remembered. His invisible army, his purpose, his redemption. The sun set over the desert, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. And for the first time in years, the stranger who'd called himself Ezekiel thought that maybe, just maybe, the books were finally beginning to balance. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.